Hi folks, welcome again to our podcast, My Life with Robert Burns. Today, Jim Thompson and myself are talking to one of our cronies from around the Burns world. Hi Jim, how are you doing?
Doing great, thanks Douglas. Hi everybody.
Today we've got joining us from the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, the Learning Manager, cronies everywhere. Please welcome Chris Waddell.
Hello. I'm very happy to be taking part in this today, Douglas, and I'm looking forward to it.
That's great. Well, nice to see you, Chris. Perhaps you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and maybe also a wee bit about the museum, because there's some people out there might have not had the opportunity to visit the museum yet.
No bother. I find it hard to believe that people haven't visited the fantastic Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, best small museum in Scotland, although obviously I've got a bit of a partisan view of that there. But as you mentioned, I'm the learning manager there. Douglas, that's a post I've had for about 8 years now, and I've worked in museums for about 15 years. I'll speak a wee bit about the museum in a moment, and I'll tell you a wee bit about myself first. My name's Christopher Waddell. I'm from South Lanarkshire, East Kilbride as a matter of fact. I grew up just on the edge of the town. Grew up there through the 70s and 80s and 90s and had a very happy childhood and a big family there. I've got 5 siblings, older siblings, so I'm the youngest and therefore the spoilt one, the baby. My parents both Glaswegians. My father was born in Tradeston, my mother born in Govan, but they both grew up in Pollock, so I've got a fairly good Keeley pedigree, I have to say, and the family eventually, after a circuitous route, moved out to East Kilbride. I went to a place called Hunter High there, which was the alma mater of some notables, Scottish notables. One, Alistair McCoist, was in the class of my older brother. Julie Wilson Nimmo was a friend of mine who's famous through appearing on Chewing the Fat and was notable as Miss Hooley in Balamori. I'm afraid that's a demographic. It's a wee bit below me in terms of age, but I understand she was very popular. Various others are from the town, so it's quite a good wee town. Scotland's premier new town, the 6th largest town and still growing, as the signs tell you. It never seems to grow big enough to be the 5th, funnily enough, but maybe the signs are just old. But yeah, grew up in East Kilbride, went to Hunter High, and did a number of jobs. My first ever job was as an electrical engineers technician in one of the numerous electronics factories that used to abound in East Kilbride. I'm happy to say that 30 years on from that, I still have absolutely no idea about electrical engineering. I did that job as a YTS, a member of the Mrs. Thatcher's youth training scheme, which didn't serve me very well, I have to say. But after a wee while, I decided that wasn't for me. Went to art college, dropped out, joined a rock band, grew my hair long, decided that I wasn't going to be a rock star, mainly because we were tough. I then get involved, a really pivotal moment in my life, actually, in conservation and wildlife and the countryside. And that was a path that I went down for many years, with an intervening few years working for Coca-Cola in East Kilbride, the 2nd best soft drink in the world, as we Scots all know. And then I went on ultimately to do my degree, which I did at Auchincruive in Ayr. Did a degree in countryside management. Spent a number of years working in land management, nature conservation, doing various jobs, a senior ranger, a biodiversity officer, things like that. And by that's a circuitous route, I came to work at the National Museum of Rural Life, come back to my hometown of East Kilbride, where that fantastic wee museum is. And it was there that I got an interest in museums. But my interest in Burns actually stems from a few years before that. I had just graduated about 20 years ago and had taken a job in Cheltenham. I was living with my sister in Swindon, salubrious Swindon, and motoring up to Cheltenham on a daily basis. And I have to say, it was a moment of utter homesickness that made me go out from my sister's house and look around Swindon. One day, I went into one of these cheap bookshops and I bought 4 books, and I can remember to this day what they were. It was Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. There was Folk Tales of the Scottish Borders. There was Royal Edinburgh, a history of our capital city. And there was the complete works of Burns, one of these little cheap £5 Lomond editions. And I'd never really been encouraged to read Burns, despite the fact, interestingly, that the Hunter High School motto was "the man's the gowd." in 5 years of studying English there, I never got a word of Burns taught to me, which says something about the way the Scottish education system used to be. It's a wee bit better now, I'm happy to say.
What
But I
were
picked
the
up-
subjects you did? Sorry to interrupt, Chris. What were the subjects you did at school?
Oh, I did English, maths, history. I did art, which I very much enjoyed. I was rubbish at science and maths. I scraped through my maths O grade, but I got higher in art, English, and what else? Technical drawing, of all things, which I found quite so. Art and technical drawing were quite things that interested me. But I, like a lot of people in my generation, I kind of faffed about a wee bit at school. I never really sort of fulfilled my potential. Funnily enough, I've got an O grade in Latin, which I found it's a strange thing. My school was just a normal secondary, a council school, as it were, non-denominational, as they called it. But with a classics teacher, a formidable lady called Miss Hawes. And I did quite good at Latin. I was in the top year in second year, top class in second year 2A, which allowed me to do Latin as a no grade. And I managed to scrape through it, and it hasn't been of great, I would say it hadn't been great use to me. But of course, when I went into the field of ecology, my fellow classmates all struggled with the scientific names, which were in Latin, as you know, and I actually found that they tripped off the tongue because I having it battered into me for 3 years by this big lady. She actually wore a gown. She wore an academic gown, and she used to go up and down the corridors like a galleon in full sail. If I ever bumped into her again today, Miss Hawes, I'd be huge. She was a terrific teacher. I'd probably still be a wee bit feared for her. I imagine she's in her 70s or possibly 80s now. So I studied all that sort of thing at school. And then...
I can snap you on the O grade in Latin. I'm not quite sure what it did for me, but I remember struggling through it.
I think it's one of these things. I kind of did it so my dad could boast about it in the pub. His boy was there Latin, and my dad's from he was from a sort of particular branch of Scottish culture where Latin wasn't entirely favoured, funnily enough, Douglas. I believe it's what's known colloquially as a right blue nose, my old man. And he loved the fact that there was a Roman Catholic school just down the road from us, St. Bride's, where all my Roman Catholic mates went to. And the kids who wanted to do Latin there, funnily enough, had to come and do it under the tutelage of Miss Hawes at our school. My dad loved that story. He thought there was something brilliantly ironic about that. So he encouraged me to stick in at the Latin, and I struggled with it, I have to say. But what I would say is that it gave me an interest in language, and strange and archaic language. And I think there's something in that sort of tied me back to Burns when I first read it. Because my parents were very much Scots speakers, but they were Glaswegians, Douglas. So the Scots that I grew up with, hearing my parents speaking, they were children of the 30s and 40s in Glasgow. It's very different, obviously, from that of Burns, but it still resonated when I first read it, when I first picked up Burns. And at the time, as I say, when I picked up this book in England and read it in the wee sort of garret room I was living in, I'd moved out from my sisters after we were moved to a house in Gloucester with a workmate of mine and his wife, and they gave me digs up in their loft. It was one of these big, beautiful Victorian terraced houses. And I sat there reading Burns, and it was the bucolic elements of it which resonated with me. And I think because I did that for a living, I've always, through my dad, had this love of the outdoors, of fishing and bird watching and hiking and camping and all that stuff. I was able to then do that for a living before I gravitated towards museums.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
And when I first picked up Burns, I noticed there was so much wonderful nature poetry, descriptions of the landscape in there. And it's a wee bit of a drum of mine that I continue to bang, that Burns is recognised as this great polemicist and political writer and social commentator and romantic, large R and small r poet. And I think his nature poetry tends to get shoved away at the back of the Keatses and the Wordsworths of this world, two guys who visited the cottage in Alloway to pay homage to their great hero and literary inspiration. I actually happen to think he's a far better nature poet than them. I imagine if any English teachers are watching this, then at any time they'll burst into flames at the suggestion of this. I think he's a terrific nature poet, and I think it's that element of it that really sucked me in, I think.
Aye. Well, we've drifted a wee bit onto Burns a couple of times, so let's just finish off talking about you. What about yourself? What did you do immediately after school? Did you have any interest in sports or other activities, that kind of thing?
I wasn't particularly sporty in the conventional sense, but I really enjoyed walking in the outdoors, camping, that sort of thing. Like almost every working class Scotsman, I a cursory interest in football. That's actually grown as I've got older. I wasn't really into it as a kid. I was really more interested in music, and I played, as I've mentioned, in bands, and made a horrific racket with electric guitars and harmonicas and things like that. And the funny thing was, this would be the late 1980s and early 90s, but I had an obsession with the 1960s because growing up in the 80s, I thought the music was rotten, the music scene. So I loved things like the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones and mod music, and then I got into psychedelia and stuff and grew my hair and get pointy shoes and paisley pattern shirts, and living in the less than artistic areas of East Kilbride, you sort of ran the risk walking to the pub wearing some of that clobber youngsters, But I became obsessed with the 1960s. Funnily enough, a good friend of mine was a boy at school called Fraser Gallagher. And this is just an aside, but his father was a guy called George Gallagher, who was lead singer of a band in the 1960s called The Poets, a Glasgow band.
I watched them come at Town Hall.
Is that right? Well, you probably remember that their shtick, being the Poets, was they dressed kind of Burnsy. They had frilly shirt and Regency and the long hair. And it's a bizarre coincidence that this was one of my favourite bands as a kid, but I knew the lead singer, he was my mate's dad. And then, and it's a funny thing, at the time I was listening, I just really liked them as a band. And I was actually looking through some old CDs a few months ago, and I found one with a few Poets tracks on it. It was a compilation, it was a picture of them. I thought, God, of course, they're all dressed as Burns. And as a kid, I didn't realise it. Only just realised that quite recently. They're the Poets. They're from Scotland. Of course, they're going to dress as Burns. That was, and the flavour of all great 60s bands, they had to have a kind of shtick, a theme, a gimmick, if you like, and that was it. Yeah, so I got into all that. I played in bands. I had a very brief flirtation with studying art. I was going to be either a great artist or a rock star and live a very bohemian lifestyle, and I did neither, as it transpired, possibly because I wasn't very good at either of them. I did a year studying art before I dropped out to be in my band, as I mentioned. That didn't quite work out. I dropped out of college and about 3 weeks later get kicked out of the band for being thoroughly unreliable. I regret to admit that the rock and roll lifestyle appealed to me more than the actual ability to produce great rock music. And the other guys in the band get fed up with me just being rubbish and not turning up to rehearsals and stuff. So I get booted out, and as I say, it was immediately after that I got an employment training opportunity with the Scottish Wildlife Trust. And I put my own knowledge of wildlife and stuff into play there, and I found that I had a real, I suppose, a talent for that. I was very good at identifying things, and I did a lot of species and habitat mapping. I worked for the Scottish Wildlife Trust for about 18 months. I got a minor supervisory role. After that, I found myself at the end of my contract, worked for Coca-Cola in East Kilbride. That was meant to be for 4 weeks, as these things so often do. It was actually nearer 4 years. But during that time, saved up, applied to college, went to Auchencrew, did my degree, came out, started working in conservation, and then that brought me through a circuitous route into museums to where I am now, staring down the barrel of 50.
Well, you brought us once again back to Burns, so it is the perfect timing for us to start to go into that part of your life. So I'll get Jim to introduce that subject, and we can have a wee chat about that.
No problem.
Chris, you mentioned the book you bought. Was there anything specific in that took you to Burns?
No, like I say, I think when I had been living in England for a couple of months, and this is genuine, this is all very sort of teary-eyed and tartany and romantic. This is absolutely true. I just felt very homesick, and I felt that I was missing something, not living in Scotland. And that's in no way to attack England, a country that I'm very fond of. I had a great time there, ultimately over a space of a few years before I came back, but I just got really homesick, and I picked up Burns amongst these other books that I found in this shop. And I hadn't really read Burns. My dad, despite being a very literate man with a house full of books, was never a fan of Burns. He wasn't much of a fan of poetry to any great degree. He was a great fan of many Scots writers, in particular Robert Louis Stevenson, John Buchan and Neil Munro. They were real favourites of my dad, but not Burns. And when I took this book home, I started flicking through it. And one of the ones that it was funny, one of the first things that leapt out to me was the song Corn Rigs, because again of its sort of bucolic nature, but also it's actually used as the opening music and the soundtrack to the great 70s movie The Wicker Man, which is filmed in southwest Scotland. So I recognised it from that. So there's an element of sort of pop culture in Burns again, keeping in there. But then I started to read, and ultimately read right through the Holy Fair. And it's that opening stanza of the Holy Fair which cemented in my mind the notion that this was a great nature poet. Upon a summer Sunday morn, when nature's face is fair, I walk it forth to view the corn and snuff the caller air. The rising sun o'er Goston Muir with glorious licht was glinting. The hares were hurtling down the firs, the lavrocks they were chanting. Fou sweet that day. Fou sweet indeed, gentlemen. And what that spoke to me of was a man completely imbued with the countryside. You know, his very essence is suffused with it. And unlike Wordsworth and Keats, who were nice middle class boys who looked at the countryside from afar and commented on it, Burns is right there in the centre of it. He's got mud on his bits, and that's important with Burns. And I think what's important as well about the Holy Fair is this is a great polemical piece. This is Burns attacking the kirk, which he has his uneasy relationship with. But he chooses to open it with this amazing piece of nature poetry. And that's what said to me, he says, this is a guy of the land. This is a man that understands nature. So no matter what he's talking about, nature's always going to be there. Because of course it's natural that any great writer comments on what they understand and what's round about them. And nature was the thing for Burns. And it's the language that he uses down there. You know, the hares are hurtling down the firs. You know, if you see a hare going down a furrowed field, it's got that kind of loping gait anyway, that kind of limping walk, and it was so descriptive. But it was the atmosphere that he conjured up with that opening stanza, upon a summer Sunday morn. You know, and you get the idea of being out really early, and if you enjoy the outdoors, and if you happen to be out really early, before anyone else is up, if I'm away out fishing really early and I've gone any distance, it's a summer's morning, and it's a strange, quiet time when the light's just breaking. And I get that feeling from that, and it's almost as if Burns understood that there was something quite magical about that, about the countryside in general. He's able, you know, in a very emotional way to convey that. And when I read that stanza at that poem, despite having read a few other bits before, that was me hooked. I thought there's something special about this guy, and it wasn't the whole notion of his Scottishness and his patriotism, which is important to me, incidentally, for a number of reasons and from various sort of political standpoints, but also it was just the sheer quality of his writing and his ability to observe and create. And that's the stamp of any great writer, I think, Jim.
Where did that take you with Burns then?
Well, it meant that I read my way, and I worked my way through it. And funnily enough, it was literally just a few months after that I found myself very much in at the deep end of my very first ever Burns event. The couple that I was living with are a lovely couple, Mark and Maggie Goodchild was their name. And they were kind of folkies and kind of aging hippies, and we kind of got on really well with them, you know, taking digs to them. And Mark was a colleague of mine. I was working for Cheltenham Borough Council. I was their senior ranger in their park service, and Mark was one of the maintenance guys in the park service. And Maggie played the fiddle. She had a great interest in folk culture and folk music and stuff. And she was actually from, Mark was a Cornishman and Maggie was from the North England. She was from Yorkshire. Bradford, I think, thereabouts Maggie was from. And she played the mandolin and the fiddle and stuff like that. And she said, Chris, I'd love if we could have a Burns supper, because, you know, it was coming up to the own time. And she said, could you do that for us? And I said, well, Maggie, I've never even been to one, let alone arrange one. It was just one for her friends and family in their house. So I researched it and we sussed it out and we worked out toasts, and as luck would have it, I was coming back north to visit my parents just after the new year. On my return, I was able to procure a haggis and all the doings, and we had a Burns supper, and I addressed the haggis at it very poorly now, as I realised looking back, and quite nervously. And Maggie was really, really nervous because she'd placed the haggis on a gid plate, you know, this beautiful big piece of porcelain, and it was me about to stab it. She's like, careful with my plate. So I was interrupted my very first ever address of the haggis. And but we sort of stumbled through it. And what really struck me about that whole thing is, of all the people there, I think it was about 8 or 10 folks that I can't really mind. It was quite a small affair, a family affair. But I was one Scot, and there was one Irish lad there who was their daughter's boyfriend, although he was very naturalised as an Englishman, but his parents were Irish. And other than that, the rest were all English people. And they absolutely loved it. They loved the poetry, they loved the proceedings. I think they loved the sense of occasion, which is something about Burns suppers. I think that even folk who aren't necessarily real Burnsians are hugely familiar with his work, like the sense of occasion, the sense of ritual that's attached to it. And I think that's what appealed to him. But the one thing that really sticks in my mind is when the haggis was being served up, their son, Leon, who was probably only about, 19 or 20 at the time, I remember him sitting with a fork full of haggis, which he'd never eaten before, and he eventually put it in his mouth, and there was a look of utter amazement and delight on his face when he ate it. And I said, see, it's good stuff. You know, try it. Don't think about it. you know. And I think the notion, it's minced offal and oatmeal and cooked in a sheep's stomach. And when you say that to folk, I think it's best to say, it's haggis, just eat it. And I think, I don't know if he ever became hooked on Burns, but I'm sure he became hooked. Well, do you know, he actually came to Edinburgh to live for a couple of years, no long after that. So I think I must have made some effect on the lad. But that was my first ever, I suppose, occasion that was involved with Burns. And then ultimately I stayed in England for just over 2 years. I came back up north, I had a job with Stirling Council, working as a biodiversity officer with them. And when I found myself in and around Stirling, I was actually living in Kincardine at the time in a wee cottage and motoring each day into Stirling. And then whilst I was working in Stirling, I developed a greater love for Scots culture. And like a lot of, I suppose, young and urban people in Scotland, I grew up not hugely influenced by a sort of broad Scots culture, language, music, literature. As I've explained, I was more interested in long hair and Jimi Hendrix and stuff like that. So it wasn't until I was about 30 that, and I think, and that possibly sounds a wee bit silly, but it wasn't until I was living in England I realised how Scottish I was. And when I came back, I kind of started to sort of find myself more and more drawn towards that. And Stirling was a great place to explore Scottish culture. So I visited all the historic sites there and aroundabouts, and visited Bannockburn, and of course there's a Burnsian connection with that. And my interest in a broader sense of Scots culture grew, and it was at this time that I had a wee bit of a change in political outlook as well. I'm not going to go into that too much, but you're both smart gentlemen, and you can work out what that was. And it's a political change which has remained with me to this day. So I hope I don't get assassinated now after this goes live when I walk out. I became a more Scottish Scot, I think, and Burns was a big part of that. And it was around about that time, whilst I was working in Stirling, I had to do the thing. Here's some real council jargon for you. I was a local biodiversity action plan officer. There you go, look at that, gents. And I had to write and get other people to write species and habitat action plans for threatened species and habitats within the Stirling area. They're all collated into a big thing called a BAP, a biodiversity action plan for the area. But one of the elements of it was that each species had to have a cultural section written in it, and why it was important to Stirlingshire or Scotland in a broader sense. So I started researching all these plants and animals, the Scots names, the nomenclature of the Scots that was attached to them, and folklore and stories. And of course, Burns came up time and again because of nature. And the one thing, what really sticks in my mind of all the different ones, I had to write one for lowland waders, wading birds and lowland farms, and the snipe was in it, the bird, the snipe. Burns referred to it as the blitter from the boggy in the poem Mahogany. And I remembered that, and I thought, that's fantastic, you know, researching why is it called a blitter? Well, it's a corruption of the word bleater, because when the snipe makes its drumming sound, it sounds a bit like a sheep. So you kind of go down these amazing rabbit holes into the language and the culture. And Burns, again, sort of, he kept popping his head up in my life in various ways, and I became more and more interested in him. And then it just became more and more, it was almost like I don't wish to sound off colour here, but it was almost like an addiction, because it grew and it grew and it became a bit more all-encompassing. I'm sure you gents appreciate that. And then the job at the National Museum of Rural Life at Kitterside came up. They wanted a learning officer with a background in biodiversity, but you had to understand about Scottish culture and the countryside. You know, all my interests and my time at Auchincrew. So I applied for it and I got the job. And you can't discuss the history and culture of the Scottish countryside again without bringing Burns into it, and he came up again and again. And one year we took a tent, a stand every year at the Royal Highland Show at Ingliston, and it had to be themed, and we had meetings about how. And one year I said, look, it was 2009, the year of homecoming. Burns was one of the big pillars of that, and the boss, a chap called Duncan Dornan, said, well, look, let's do Burns. He's got the closest tie-in with things that are rural. And that gig landed on my desk to prepare a lot of the stuff for that. How did we moved a big old Scots Plew out of the museum. We took it along, we dressed it, everything. We even had a toy mouse to sit next to it and things like that. We had Burns music playing. We got some of our art and interpretation people to recreate the hearth from the cottage and things like that. There was a famous silhouette pictures put up of Burns and Clarinda and stuff like that. And again, it gave me a chance to sort of indulge this kind of ever-growing passion. And I worked at that job for 6 years. And during that time, the museum in Alloway had developed and reopened, and the job for learning manager came up, and I applied for it, and I didn't get it, and I was hugely disappointed, and then the person left, so I applied for it again, and then I didn't get it. And the person who'd got it the second time stuck it for 6 weeks, and she left, and I think they get fed up with this, and they phoned me up because I was second on the list. So there I am. I'm officially Mr. Second Best. They says, look, this person's left, but you're still within the time for us to offer this post. I hope that's true. I hope I've not created a storm here. I hope I don't have HR people threatening to kill me for telling you all this. But I was then offered the post. I jumped at the chance, and that was it. And I grew more and more sort of sucked into the Burns world, as it tends to do. And it's a funny thing, gentlemen, when I went there, I thought I really knew it about Burns, and I realised within days that I didn't know a lot about Burns, because you can know quite a bit about Burns, but you don't realise how much you don't know until you get drawn into that world. Then I meet cantankerous old guys in Burns clubs, no mentioning any names, who were happy to put me straight on where I was wrong and what I didn't know. And that's one of the wonderful things about Burns, is he's a kind of literary and historic gift that keeps giving, isn't he? Look at the amount of research. There's a department in Glasgow Uni as an adjunct to the literature department. It's dedicated to Burns study. There's umpteen folk working it. You know, it's amazing. And I think that's why there's always something new to learn about Burns. And every time you read through his poems again, even though you've read it before, they sort of mean different things to you as you get older, as great writing should. As you garner more life experience, Burns means more to you, I think.
It must be a bit like a busman's holiday, though, given your interest in Burns being amongst all those artefacts, and I mean, the history of Burns is sitting in that cottage.
It's one of the things, Jim, the day-to-day, you know, the shuffling of papers about my desk and rotas and stuff like that, and budgets and all the usual stuff, means that quite a lot of the time I can go for days at a time working at the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum without thinking about Robert Burns, you know, and that's the nature of work and life. And see, when that happens, there's a thing that I do. I'll wait till the quiet part of the day when the museum's quieting down, and I'll go into the exhibition and I'll take a wee look around and I'll look at things I've looked at a million times before. And I sometimes think I have to do that. And I'll tell you for why. Any element of your working life can make you sickened because of the grief that we all suffer through our working lives. People want this, people want that, disagreements, office politics and stuff. And one of the things I decided years ago was that the annoying elements of my working life were not going to colour my love of Burns in any way. So I take time to step back, or if I happen to be up at the other end of the site, go into the cottage. And there's something wonderful about that wee cottage when you're in it yourself. And I sometimes sit one of the chairs by the hearth, and they're just replicas, of course, but I love to just sit there. And you tell yourself a thing that I tell the children when I take them round the school groups, is that this is the very floor that Burns walked upon. You're literally walking in the footsteps of history here, arguably one of the most significant people, possibly the most significant person in our history, certainly in our literary and cultural history. And that's a momentous thing. You know, it's the enormity of it actually escapes you on a day-to-day basis. Or sometimes I'll go upstairs, I'll find an excuse to go to the upper vault, the storage area upstairs, and I'll look at some manuscripts. And that's when you really get the notion, you as it is held in a manila folder and things like that, you don't touch them, obviously. And I want to reassure anybody that's ultimately going to watch this, I do this with the utmost care. But when you look at these manuscripts, you think that Burns held this in his hand. He put pen to paper here. He created this thing, you know. And if you look at a wee bit of paper, which incomplete as it is, the first line is, "And surely you'll be your pint stoop." The enormity of that, you know, sometimes sinks in. And you think, folk all around the world sing this on one night of the year, but countless millions of them do. And here it is, committed to paper for one of the first times. And it's started, and I think I'm really grateful, Jim, that I've not lost that ability to still be utterly thrilled by that. And when I talked about those things I was interested in when I was a youngster, see, with that's still like being a wee boy sometimes, getting to do that, you know. And I consider myself, because of my interest, not just in Burns, but our culture as a whole, and our language and everything that we as Scots have contributed to the world. This is the stuff that one of our greatest contributors made, and I can go and look at it on a daily basis, and I'm hugely grateful. And I feel really privileged, actually. You know, I don't make any bones about that. I know absolutely how lucky I am. I sometimes have to tell myself that I'm indulging my hobby and getting paid for it, which is, you know, it's fantastic. You know, I can't really knock that. I'll not get rich doing it, not working for the blooming National Trust of Scotland, but you get rich in other ways. There's a sense of enrichment there that you get, and that's lucky. And if anybody is watching, especially any of my superiors, the National Trust of Scotland are a fantastic organisation to work with.
How do you enjoy going to the Burns suppers in the cottage?
They're fantastic, because I think again it's that sense of history. I'm not really mad for. I'm not really hugely interested in the Burns clubs and stuff. I'm a member of Irvine, because it's not a million miles away from me, and I was a member of Alloway for a while, but I kind of stepped back from that, and I was involved in a small way with the Federation for a couple of years. But the suppers at the cottage, I get to go to the one at the cottage, not every year, but in some years, and I tend to go to the one in the Bachelors Club as well, which I absolutely love. It's an incredible place to attend a Burns supper. But when you go there, again, you get that sense of ritual and occasion that most people would get if they really understand what a Burns supper is about. But it's magnified when you have it in Burns Cottage, because we're there on his birthday, yards from where he entered, kicking and screaming into the world. But it's also where the first Burns supper was held. in 1801. So there's something kind of strangely cyclical about that. You know, we started these suppers again in 2016, and it was driven, I have to say, by our good friend, a great pal of mine, a great friend to the museum, Hugh Farrell, who you both most certainly know. Hugh's a consummate Burnsian, you know, with that old notion, if do you prick me? If you prick me, do I not bleed? If you prick Hugh, his haggis comes out his veins. You know, it's such a consummate Burnsian. And he's actually a bit of a mentor and a great influence on me, actually, Hugh. I wouldn't want to embarrass him or anything, but, you know, he's a guy I really look up to. But he really drove that. And you've had the privilege, Jim, of delivering. I was there and I heard your immortal memory at the cottage supper. So you must know yourself what it feels like to stand in there and to take part in the proceedings. And it's quite an amazing thing. And I think it's that sense that not only are you standing in a historic place, but you're actually contributing to history. You know, we brought those suppers back and now they're fully recorded, and the bill of fare and the paperwork from it goes into the museum vault every year, and there's a full record of it made, and it's filmed now as well. We have other means by which we record these things. So you're actually becoming part of the Burns story. You're becoming part of that history of the cottage by taking part in these things. And of course, there's people come from all over the world, as you know, to attend it. And it's not inexpensive, we admit that, but every penny raised goes then into the upkeep of the cottage, which is a continuous and sometimes thankless task. And yes, the NTS got a wee bit of grief in recent years for the state of the cottage, but that's because to save up, we spent a colossal amount of money on it, the better part of $250,000 to do it properly. You know, and it's really the best it's been in decades and decades now, because we took our time with it and spent the money on it. And it was difficult to raise money for that. I think there's a notion that the National Trust for Scotland has great wedges of gold buried underneath castle vaults somewhere, but we don't. We're a charity and we have to raise that money. But it's through the ongoing interest in Burns that we're able to do that. And that's an interesting thing as well. Burns is, I believe Burns is good for you. He's good for Scotland. There's something very positive about the whole culture around about him. The sense of, you know, fellowship and the fraternal feelings that you get when you attend a supper. Not just fraternal, because I'm happy to say the old notion of women not getting to Burns suppers is very much on its way out now, because I think that's utterly ridiculous and something I absolutely very fervently disagree with, as a matter of fact. But what Burns can do is he can contribute still 250 or 260 years after his death. The report came out earlier last year, the one that Murray Pittock worked on and compiled with other particularly brainy people at Glasgow University, economists and what have you. And Burns is worth a massive amount to the Scottish economy, and that's not to sully him and to reduce it all to pounds, shilling and pence. But I think it says a lot about why people come to Scotland and visit, you know, especially people who are the product of the Scots diaspora, you know, people from Canada and the United States and South Africa and Australia and all these places, and other places that have no connection with Scotland but have a connection with Burns, especially, you know, Russia and places like that. They'll come here and they want to see that cottage and they're prepared to spend money to take part in it. And that's good, because it means that we can continue to do this work. And it is, to me, it's important, because in preserving Burns, you don't just preserve the memory of a long dead poet, you preserve something which is living, which is the love of Burns and the language. And that's a hugely important thing to me. I sit on the Scottish Language Centres Council, represent the museum on that. A great lover of the Scots tongue. It's something that I grew up hearing, and believe you me, again, like Burns, I thought I understood Scots and knew about Scots until I moved to Ayrshire, especially the good people of East Ayrshire, where when I hear some of my colleagues in the museum chatting in full flight, and that dialect, East Ayrshire dialect form of the Scots language, you know, and lived down here for a long time, worked down here for a long time now, and yet still I hear things I thought, what are they saying? I don't quite get it. It's amazing. And I would hate for that to die out. And I think that's why we do an important job in helping to preserve not just the memory of Burns, but trying to keep an element of this culture alive and to take it forward.
And you've got two great supporters of the Scotch Lead as your previous screever and Rob Wilson and the current screever, Tracy Harvey.
Indeed, absolutely. Yeah. Rab's it's a word I tell you use a lot, the notion of a larger than life character, and Mr. Wilson is absolutely that. I mean, Rab's one of these guys. You know how sometimes when there's a bit of a bash going on and you're trying to get folk to recite something and they're a wee bit shy. There's not a problem there with Rab. It's getting them to stop. But Rab's actually, I mean, I'm a good friend of Rab's. I'm actually a fan of his poetry as well. You know, I'm not just being sort of mealy-mouthed about that. Rab's a brilliant writer, but he's a man who's absolutely infused with the spirit of Burns because he grew up with him and he took Burns as a lead a great many years ago, and he doffs his hat to Burns every time he puts pen to paper, and it's written. And that's Scott's tongue, and it's performed. I say performed because it's not really a performance with Rab. You know, I've got colleagues, right, who've had emails from Rab, and they'll phone through to him, obviously going to come through and translate this for me because Rab writes as he speaks, and Scott and it says some of my English colleagues, what's that word? And I thought, I'll just tell you what he's after. And of course Tracy, who, you know, is flying the flag for the girls there, and she's a brilliant poet as well. But Tracy's a woman with a tremendous sense of humour, which comes across in her poetry, and she does it all with the kind of this kind of outward mask of being East Ayrshire housewife, and she's much more than that, as you and I know. And she's a riot, and her amazing ability to sort of place herself into the fairly inestimable shoes of Kate from Tam O'Shanter and Jean Armour and people like that, and view things from a female perspective is what makes her good. But of course they do this through the medium of their own language, their own lead, and it's tremendous, and that's to be hugely encouraged. And I'm no sort of a poet at all, and I hugely admire their ability to do that. And I think it's something that it's one of the things I'm really proud of in the museum. You know, in my own wee way, I've contributed by, you know, putting the Screever post together and stuff like that, with a lot of help from my colleagues, the learning team, which is sadly defunct now, unfortunately, as a victim of COVID. I'm afraid I lost the team, and we're having to start because of massive job losses in the organisation. But hopefully we can rebuild that again once all this insanity is over, and we can get back to doing what we do, teaching people about Robert Burns and about the language that he used.
Any notion of ever getting back to in some form or other with the Federation again, Chris?
I don't know, Jim. I mean, if I can be perfectly frank here, I don't know. I wasn't sure that I was of any great use when I was part of it before, mainly because I'm a bit of a useless article. But I think I don't know. It's a very specific thing, the Federation. I found that out when I became involved in it. And it's involved with a very specific element of the Burns culture that I tend not to take much to do with, and that's the clubs. And I think there's people better placed than me to do it. I think we live in very different times, gentlemen. One of the things I found interesting, right, is when I went to meetings of the Federation.
Executive committee meetings.
Executive committees and stuff, the executive meetings and things like that. I found I was the youngest person in the room, and I'm, as I say, staring down the barrel of 50, and I don't think that's healthy for the movement. And I think we have to explore ways of getting younger people involved in the Burns movement, and it has to be relevant to them, not relevant to us. And I think that's a problem we all make as we get older, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone, you know. I mean, some of my younger members of staff are discussing things about how we can engage with schools and all, and my default is, we could make a wee learning resource that they can walk about with in a clipboard. And my younger mates, a clipboard, Chris, I mean, come on. So I'm as guilty of this as we have to move on. Here we are doing it, gentlemen, we're having a Zoom call of all things, a Zoom meeting. So it's not that difficult to do. But I think the Federation, it's an interesting thing. And I think it's interesting because, again, it's like those suppers in the cottage. It's a huge part of the story of Burns and the history of Burns. Because what Burns does as an historic individual, which makes him very different from other writers, is he creates a culture and indeed a cult around about him, which spirals off in all sorts of directions. So when you look at, take one of those other poets I mentioned earlier, Keats or Wordsworth, there will be societies attached to them, but nothing like the scale that's attached to Burns, with the commitment, the lifelong commitment, and indeed the obsession that people have with Burns. And it'd be easy for me to turn around and say, oh, God, look, that guy's a Burns obsessive. But then I realise I'm one as well, otherwise I wouldn't do this. It's just that obsession, it manifests itself in different ways. And I think that the Federation, which is my doomsaying, I mean, feel free to disregard that. I hope you do, because I hope it does survive. And I think there's some really good people there now that are taking it forward. And I certainly feel you were part of that, Jim, at the time. I think you brought a kind of fresh approach to it, and there's people that continue to do that. And I hope that continues to grow and to garner, and I hope they are able to bring more folk in. I hope so.
Well, at the end of the day, they're just there to promote Burns, no matter what the individuals involved in it are. But it has moved. I mean, the last, I would say, 10 years have been, I mean, a seed shift in terms of the Burns Federation. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice in terms of your ability to help the organisation. But however, that's a thing for you, not for me.
That's very generous of you to say, Jim. Very generous of you to say. I mean, I'm involved in other things as well. There's an organisation called Burns Scotland that I'm involved in, and that's the various heritage bodies and museums across the, serried ranks of wee tweedy folk like myself that are in charge of all these bits of paper and wonderful things and artefacts, from small local authority museums up to the bigger players like Glasgow Uni, ourselves in the NTS and NMS and national museums in in Edinburgh, but also Glasgow museums as well, because they've all got significant collections. And Burns Scotland is an umbrella group that seeks to work together to coordinate how they're all looked after. And that can be interesting as well, because one thing that you'll find is, and I think Burns would absolutely have understood this, that when you get a bunch of organisations like that together around the one table, the bits of paper don't have Burns poetry written on them. It's swamped with bureaucracy, and trying to get all these different organisations to agree to do things the same way can be painful to the point of being heartbreaking. My poor old pal Jerry Carruthers has sat at the head of that particular table for a number of years now, and I know he's found it. I've had a few pints with Jerry over the years, and I know it. But again, we still managed to rub along, and I think what you said a moment ago there, Jim, really hits the nail on the head. That no matter what the different outlooks of the individuals or the people involved are, we're still all working towards a common aim, which is the promotion and the continued love, Burns and the language and the poetry. And the story of the man himself.
What a tremendous way to finish off this podcast. I think that sentiment is just perfect. So I just want to thank you for your time, Chris. It's been great listening to you this afternoon. And I'm sure our audience will thoroughly enjoy hearing about your life with Robert Burns. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Douglas. And if they don't enjoy listening to me, they can come to the museum and enjoy the man himself. He's far more interesting than I am.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris.
Cheers, man.